Greetings, and welcome to this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo. The most dramatic deed in Socrates' life was its end. At age 70, Socrates, the philosopher, was found guilty by his city, Athens, of capital crimes and sentenced to death. After a brief stay in jail, occasioned by the chance occurrence of a religious festival, Socrates calmly drank the hemlock. His death is depicted in this dialogue, Plato's Phaedo. But only the very first part and the very last part of this dialogue concerns Socrates' deeds that day. The great majority of the dialogue concerns his speeches, and these speeches are almost as famous as his famous end. For in these speeches, on the last day of his life, facing his death, Socrates argues for the immortality of the soul. These beautiful speeches have inspired hope not only in his friends who were there with him that day, but also in innumerable readers over the last 2,500 years. Socrates' speeches arise from his striking assertion that the true philosopher wants to die, and that philosophy is, quote, the practice of dying and being dead. His friends ask him to defend that position, which looks like special pleading coming from a man who will soon be executed. What are his arguments for the immortality of the soul? They fall into three main parts. First, Socrates argues that the soul existed before its union with the body. His main proof is his claim that all of our knowledge is, quote, recollection, that is, remembering things that we learned before we were born. But even if that's true, his friends raise the possibility that the soul dies with the body. In response, in the second part of his speeches, Socrates argues that the soul, as something invisible, has no parts, and so cannot come to be or fall apart the way that the body, which is composed of parts, does. After a moment of silence and reflection, his young friends offer counter-arguments to this position. One claims that certain invisible things, such as harmonies, cease to be. Another suggests that perhaps the soul does last a long time, but is still not immortal. Maybe it can get worn out. In response, Socrates offers a digression on the importance of not losing hope and hating all arguments, a disease that he calls misology, just because all of our arguments do not work out the way we wish. He then launches into the third part of his speeches, to prove that the soul does not just pre-exist the body, but also lasts forever. First, he rebuts the argument that the soul is like a harmony. Then he offers a long and deeply important second digression on his own journey as a thinker. He says that he began as a natural philosopher, that is, someone who sought to attain knowledge of the causes of all things. He says that he soon lost hope, both in his own ability to explain natural things and in other thinkers' attempts to do so. He turned instead, he said, to speeches, in what he calls his second best sailing. Now, what Socrates means by this second sailing seems to be that he would rely on what is said, on common speech, as the safest form of explanation of things. For example, that one person is taller than another by greatness, and the other shorter by smallness. Not that one is taller by a head, and the other shorter by a head, since that would mean that the same things can cause the same beings to be both tall and short. Now, in this digression on his last day, Socrates admits that he was a natural scientist as a young man, and even more, that he seems never to have given up the desire to know nature. Instead, he took up a different means of pursuing that knowledge. However, in the context of this dialogue, this long digression is meant to support his final argument for the immortality of the soul. What he says is that just as the hot itself can have nothing to do with the cold itself, or the odd with the even, so too, if the soul is life itself, it can have nothing to do with death, and vice versa. So, the kinds of topics that Socrates turns to in his second sailing, the just itself, or the good itself, or the beautiful itself, these things seem to support his claim that the soul lasts forever. In the rest of his speeches, before his demise, Socrates goes on to describe what he calls the true earth, as he calls it, which includes a comprehensive picture of this world, and most importantly, the rewards and punishments that await the virtuous and the vicious after death. Rewards and punishments that seem to involve still having our bodies. Now, he calls this account of the true earth a myth, which encourages us to take seriously the question of how we should live this life. One wonders if Socrates means for his myth to follow from his arguments about the soul's immortality, or if rather his arguments are meant to justify the account of life and death that he offers in his myth. Certainly he says that even he himself is not immune to the misgivings that are affecting his friends. In his digression on his natural science, for example, Socrates says that if it were up to his body alone, his body would have long ago run away from jail and the death that awaits him. This joke on Socrates' part reminds us that we can never separate the speeches in a Platonic dialogue from the deeds. The great deed in this dialogue, the one that hovers over all the dialogues, is Socrates' death. It hovers as the end of ends in the lives of us all. The Socrates whom we meet at the beginning of the Phaedo is facing that deed by writing poems and offering prayers. He continues his efforts in the dialogue itself by sharing speeches with his friends. He knows that speeches are less than satisfying when confronting many of the deeds of life, above all, death. But he strongly counsels us not to lose hope and to abandon speeches. His account of his second sailing suggests that early in his own life he accepted that he could not, with his unassisted reason, grasp the whole truth. Perhaps he would be visited, he says, with a divine speech. But in lieu of that divine dispensation, Socrates demonstrates that pursuing even provisional knowledge brings great pleasure. At the same time, he reminds us that no pleasure, at least in human experience, is unmixed with pain. Thank you for joining this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo.